Good morning to our Robyn Cam viewers out there. We're coming to you live from the Adelson Library at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. We're actually overlooking the Cornell feeders at Sapsucker Woods and about 200 feet away from the robin's nest itself. I'm Charles Eldermeyer, and I'm super excited today to bring you the opportunity to hear more about robins and nest monitoring from Robyn Bailey. Robyn is the project leader for the Cornell Lab's NestWatch project. So good morning, Robyn. Thanks so much for making the time to meet with us today.
Yes, thanks, Charles, for having me, and thank you to everybody listening in. I'm excited to be here today.
Well, as I said before, we're pretty excited to have you here. You, I think, are going to be fairly new to our CAM audience. So I wonder if you might tell them a little bit about your background and sort of, who you are here at the lab and what got you here, I guess.
Yeah, so a little bit about my backstory. So I am the project leader for NestWatch at the Cornell Lab. This is a citizen science project where we encourage people who find a nest, like the robin's nest, either on your home or in your yard or even in your nest box, to report that to the lab. We've been tracking nesting bird success across the country for over 50 years.
Wow.
So yeah, it's really exciting and it's a really interesting long-term project. I'm a certified wildlife biologist. I have a master's degree in fisheries and wildlife, so I feel really excited to be able to use that background to study birds, especially common backyard birds that people love. But an interesting story about me is that I've have come a long way, and I got kind of a late start to this whole thing. We were talking a little bit earlier. I shared this story about the very first bird I observed as a pretty, grown college person was the American robin. So this was kind of a new experience for me in college, learning bird identification and bird study. So the very first thing, I looked out onto my college campus in Montgomery, Alabama, and noticed an American robin hopping along, and that was my first bird ID. So
that's a perfect bird given your name too. I think it's a fun thing. And I think a lot of our viewers will probably relate to the idea of there being sort of a spark bird, a bird that really catches the imagination and helps you dive in with full enthusiasm to what the world of birds can offer.
So that really was a turning point for me. That is exactly the moment that set me on my path towards bird study, and here I am.
Yeah,
so.
That's awesome. That's great. So you mentioned a couple things here that I want to delve into a little bit. First, I want to give our viewers just a heads up about this talk. We'll probably cover a little bit about NestWatch and what it's like to monitor nests and sort of the interesting things that have gone on with Project NestWatch. And we'll be covering a bunch of questions about robins that people have submitted. We'll be getting into those. And if you do have any questions during this live chat, if you want to tweet them to us at Cornell Robyns, you can tweet them to us either directly or with the hashtag Robyn Talks Robins. We thought that was really great that we had somebody who's an expert on nesting birds named Robyn here at the lab that could talk with us about our great robins on cam. So you said obviously scientists are monitoring bird nesting, right? Mm-hmm. But it sounds like with NestWatch, normal people are monitoring it too. So how does that work? That normal people can, is that even permitted? For people to interact with birds? It's kind of, I can imagine people being a little worried about that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So absolutely, people are out there every day interacting with birds and monitoring them. Our community of NestWatchers, what they do is they get a special certification process. They go through a little bit of training material through the NestWatch Citizen Science Project, where they learn how to approach a nest and how to engage with it responsibly. So there are certain things that you do or do not do around a bird's nest. And so, you mentioned permits. You don't handle birds without a permit. So for NestWatch, you just simply glance into a nest or a nest box and report what you see, but we don't touch or interfere. We let nature take its course. And yeah, people have been reporting nests to us from all over the country for a really long time. And, so far it's worked out really well for science and for the people who are learning firsthand about the birds.
So do people just call you up on the phone and tell you what they're seeing? Should we put your phone number in a crawl across the bottom of the screen? Is that the best way to get that information to you?
People certainly call with their questions, but for data submission, that definitely happens online. Otherwise, all I would do me to take notes all day long.
Yeah.
We have a great website for data entry and called nestwatch.org. And we just recently developed a mobile app so you can take your phone, download the NestWatch app, and report from wherever you happen to be.
Oh, that's cool. I could grab a check in a nest box on your property or something like that. One weird thing is I would have thought that the birds that we're talking about here, like these robins, are these birds actually even interesting to NestWatch? So this common bird that's nesting almost everywhere, it seems like, certainly like physically everywhere, from the forests to, overhangs and doorways and things like that. So I'm surprised we don't already kind of know everything that we might want to know about them. So what sorts of things are we learning from these, regular birds? Why are they important?
Yeah, regular old common birds are actually what we really encourage people to monitor, because that is where we get data for an entire species across its entire breeding range. So we're not just interested in a specific rare species that only breeds in one location. That's interesting, but it's hard to engage a lot of people to study those birds.
Sure.
So what we really want to know are, how are robins doing across the whole range? How do they differ from north to south and from east to west? Because they really are in all 50 states and in Canada and Mexico as well. So we're really wanting to see how they're doing across the entire breeding range.
So given that you're studying all these birds, and one thing I think is interesting, and I know this is sort of a setup question because I know a little bit about it here, but you mentioned that people can enter their data online, but that you've been getting data for like 60 years or something. So how is it you have a treasure trove of data going back that long, given that the internet's only existed since 1999 or whatever, right? Like, how's that work? That you guys have such a rich history.
Yeah, so originally people would actually submit these paper index cards, and it was called the Cornell, or the North American Nest Record Card Program, offered by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which was really a mouthful. And the acronym wasn't very good. So over the years that's changed, but we have filing cabinets and huge archives of all these handwritten cards that people filled out. And there have been lots of studies that were done mining the data from those cards submitted by bird enthusiasts. And so those have been used in their day just to explore some of the early stuff that was known about robins, like when do they lay eggs and where do they start incubation in the east versus the west. And so lots of cool information has come out of that. And now, of course, everything is digital. So that really makes this process of doing the science a lot more rapid. So we can, at the end of the year, I can analyze all of the robin success from around the different regions and see how they did.
That's awesome.
Put it in a report, and it's really facilitated the data analysis. Compared
to like picking through cards, I can only imagine.
Definitely.
So, not just in robins, but in all these birds that are being monitored, can you point to anything that you feel like has been learned that couldn't have been learned without it? Whether it's sort of broad general things or neat specific stories that have happened from monitoring birds in this way. Anything like that that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with a few kind of specific anecdotes about things that we have learned about robins, and then I'll talk about some of the bigger picture issues. So, you mentioned robins are so common. Is there anything left to learn about them? And yet we still see citizens discovering new and interesting things all the time. So, in the past, citizens have reported robins nesting in the autumn and winter.
Wow.
So we get a couple of reports of that each year, and so that's something that I think is really interesting.
Is that usually in the south, or?
It varies. Wow. Yeah, different places. But yes, and whether or not that's a trend or just a couple of isolated incidences, we don't really know. But so robins are doing that, and they're sometimes nesting in really strange habitat types. So we have a population in the Boston area that's nesting in Phragmites, which is a giant reed that is not often used by robins at all. So there are these kind of specific things where individuals are certainly picking up on novelties and discoveries. And we've noticed that with other birds too, juncos, bluebirds. Citizens are discovering things about very common birds and reporting it. And so we help them bring those discoveries to the rest of the bird-loving world.
That's great.
And then with respect to the bigger picture, what we're really trying to look at, and some folks have examined this with robins, are there changes in time? So there have been these really great 30-year studies where they're looking at changes in the timing of robins nesting as it relates to climate change. And so far, they don't seem to have started any earlier or any later. So maybe that's a good thing. We don't really know yet where that's going, but it seems like they're pretty robust.
Yeah.
So
they're a great big bird.
They're a big bird.
That's often why they're a first bird for many people.
Right.
They're in their backyard and they're big enough to see without binoculars, and they look so striking.
Yeah. And so maybe that dietary diversity is really going to pay off for them. And
yeah. So is that same pattern not being seen in other birds then? So the robins don't seem to have been affected over the last 30 years, but do you guys have data for other species that are different?
Yeah. So to compare that with another species, the tree swallow, which is a long distance migrant and eats only flying insects, we have seen a shift in when they start their timing of their nesting cycle, and it's getting earlier over the last 30 to 40 years.
Wow.
So a really specialist on those flying insects is dependent on its food to be available, and has to time its nest around when those resources are going to be most abundant. Yeah,
and as these late season snowstorms, as we've had a couple here, it's just, gosh, who knows what's going on with the weather sometimes. That's really interesting, though, that robins seem to be so far not showing any pattern that is affecting some of these more migratory species. And we have a couple questions about robins in the winter that I'm going to hold till later, so we can stay focused on NestWatch for now. You had mentioned there being a nest monitoring certification, and that probably part of that is learning a lot about how to monitor nests, I would imagine, right? Do you want to maybe spend a little bit of time talking about what it's like to go out and be a nest watcher, so that some viewers who maybe have never even found a nest or have been very careful to not disturb a nest might understand why these techniques work and why citizens like themselves might consider getting involved.
Yeah, that's an interesting place to start. I would say that probably a good thing to start overall by saying is that nest watchers are a community of people who care about birds, and they're always going to put the bird's best interest at the center of what they're doing. So we don't nest watch without that sense of responsibility. So it's just kind of embedded in the program, and you'll hear those messages from us repeatedly. But your first experience as a nest watcher will probably be through our website or our Facebook page or downloading the app. And regardless of how you enter the project, you're gonna see that we have a code of conduct, and those are the do's and don'ts of nest checking. And so you're gonna see that. And the certification process, it sounds like it might be hard, but it's really just reading through that. Taking a little fun quiz it's 10 questions, and it's fairly easy, just saying, I understand I'm not supposed to
it's reinforcing
to touch
Don't
to touch these birds. Don't go during really bad weather. If it's raining and bad outside, don't check the nest, and don't bother them at night when they're sleeping. I mean, they're really obvious, straightforward things that maybe need to be reinforced if you're totally new to birds, but once you learn them, it'll make complete sense to you. So you'll start getting indoctrinated into the community of nest watchers, and then you'll find a nest. The next thing to do is to simply find a nest, whether it's in your yard, or if you want to go out to a campus, your schoolyard, that's a great place to find a nest. Birds tend to nest around where people are, so we often think that they don't, but they really are nesting all around us, whether we see them or not.
So are there, it sounds like we're talking a lot about sort of natural wild nests, right? But I also know that your website has a whole big section on nest boxes or building homes to try and attract birds to places too. So I don't know if you wanted to touch on at all on what kinds of birds you might be able to attract, or what that part of your site offers, that kind of so people know maybe it's a resource they could use.
Yeah, so that's if you're exploring around on nestwatch.org, you'll run into a section of our website called All About Birdhouses, where we try to point people towards scientifically defensible nest box plans that are appropriate for those species, that are safe. They're going to keep the nestlings dry and comfortable and protected from predators. And so we do that with a couple of different resources. We have a diagram called Features of a Good Birdhouse. And then we have another tool that helps you identify which birds you can attract to your yard. And that's called the Right Bird, Right House. You can put in your region of the country, and your habitat type, and it will give you a list of birds that would nest in that area.
Oh, great.
And a nest box plan for building a nest box for them. And interestingly, we do have an American robin plan. It's
really?
It's not a nest box. It's more of a shelf, kind of like what
kind
the
of
robins are nesting
Yeah,
on.
right.
And it kind of just makes like a more stable place for them. So to give you for instance, we had a robin building a nest in our gutter, and the material just kept falling off, and it wasn't really staying because it was just too rounded. And so we have a couple of nest shelves that we put up to try to give the robin a better place to stabilize that foundation of that nest, because they do seem to like nesting on our houses.
They do, and I don't, the one, for example, that's nesting here, it's an incredible nest spot because it is completely out of the weather.
Yeah.
And this spring, being as cold and rainy as it has been, it's been pretty fun to watch them, not even need to weather the storms.
Yeah.
You'll see the wind from time to time moving the feathers of the birds, but that's about it. And they seem to gain a lot by nesting right next to our houses sometimes, or where we work. Let's see. Is there anything else about nest monitoring that you might want to share with people related to sort of how intrusive it is on the birds, or whether it has any impact that you guys have been able to tell, or anything like that regarding the nest monitoring process?
I can certainly understand the concerns about being worried about approaching a nest and bothering the birds, and that's a concern that I feel as well. We always want to be mindful of that, and lots of people have studied this, and the results are always the same, that it doesn't seem to have that much of an effect on the birds, no discernible effect. You don't, as long as you're following the protocol.
Right.
So not visiting every single day, or not doing, during bad weather. So if you're following the protocol, there should be no effect on the nest. That being said, I always use caution, and if the birds are especially timid, which individuals can be, then you want to just use your best judgment there. But,
great. And you probably don't spend much time at the nest when you're doing it either, right?
Right, less than a minute.
Yeah.
As long as it takes to peek in and count the number of eggs, and then you can move away and write down your data.
Cool. Yeah, there's something really special. I've watched robins my whole life, but it's been really fun watching on cam. Often they're nesting in places around my house where it's very hard to look into the nest. So I might be checking my nest during a NestWatch check, using my phone just to reach up above the nest, snap a picture, and then look at it down here. But to be able to actually sit there and watch these little birds breathe, watch the pin feathers starting to pop out, it's been really fun, even for me, and I've watched a lot of robins in my life, to watch that unfold with such a common bird. And I think, I have a very similar feeling about it from, being very young, even, and knowing these robins and just being like, oh, what a great bird to have around all the time. So you've mentioned this a few different times, but if people want to learn more about NestWatch or how to get involved, where should they go?
They should go to nestwatch.org. It is a website of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, so you can find it from the Lab of O website.
Great.
But if you want to get directly to it, it's nestwatch.org. And check out the photos of other people doing NestWatch. You'll see that it's fun, and you'll arm yourself with the information you need to not be so nervous about approaching a nest.
That's actually a great point. Before we leave this little section of the live chat today, you mentioned the community aspect of NestWatch, and that's something I think this audience might be really interesting, because we know that our cam watchers often really enjoy sharing their observations of what they see. They're all seeing the same thing on cam, which is kind of a different thing compared to a bunch of people watching different robin nests. So you find, if 1,000 people see the same event, there might be 1,000 different perspectives on what happened there, or picking up of a different detail. And so what kinds of places or tools, or in what ways does your NestWatch community interact? And are there ways that that NestWatch sort of facilitates, or is it sort of, are there places other than what NestWatch offers where people find that connection?
Yeah, so a great thing about NestWatch is that people often connect offline. So we have a chapters program where NestWatch chapters are just groups of people doing NestWatch in their local community. They may organize a bluebird trail, or they may lead a kids group of young birders. But we have a lot of people who are doing NestWatch offline and interacting completely offline. We also have some online spaces like a photo gallery and an annual photo competition, which is a very friendly competition. It's very welcoming to amateur photographers.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so it's it's we really just want to see the photos and the stories and hear about what you're doing. And there tends to be discussion around the photos, like, oh, you had a very successful year in New York. Well, here's what's going on in Michigan, and out in California, we're having something different happen. So there are people seeing different things in different places, and they're able to come together and discuss that.
Oh, that's great.
Even on Facebook, and we try to bring stuff to Facebook and share different interesting stories that people are seeing from around the country.
Awesome. Well, of course, any viewers out there, if you have robin nests or other nests that you've seen in your yard or documented and want to share them with us online, you can always tweet us at Cornell Robyns. You can send us an email at birdcams@cornell.edu. And of course, you can head over to NestWatch and check out the opportunities to share your images and experiences as a participant in NestWatch as well. That's a really cool thing. I've definitely checked out the images on NestWatch from time to time, because there are a lot of great ones of often little birds being fed, and a wide range of photography capturing a really neat slice of bird biology.
Mm-hmm.
So robins, I think, are, as far as I can tell from the website and through our conversations leading up to this chat, they're obviously a common species, but they're also one of the most well represented sort of open cup nesters in NestWatch, right? And I don't know if people out there know what an open cup nest is, and I wonder if you might just give them a quick description of what that is, and also sort of a general overview of the kind of nests that people are monitoring in NestWatch, if you have different kinds of nests that they might understand.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are lots of different kinds of nests, from the underground burrow cam that you guys hosted not too long ago, where you're looking at an underground nesting situation, from the open cup, like the robin and the hummingbirds and other kinds of nests that have been streamed in the past. And then we have cavity nesting birds, which is, in most cases, that's the easiest way to monitor those is with a nest box. And a nest box is just a predictable, stable place for a cavity nesting bird to nest.
Right. And a place you can get inside.
Exactly.
Right? It's hard to get inside a dead tree.
It's exactly right. And it's easy to put a cam in like your barred owl, box or a kestrel box. So you can, they're just a predictable, easy place to find a nest. But an open cup nest is really, they take a lot of different forms. The robin nest is certainly a very cup shape, but we also see it with lots of other species. It's the classic nest that you tend to think of when you think about a bird's nest. And so we see a wide variety of kinds of nests being reported to NestWatch, from cavity nesting to open cup or platform nesting, like ospreys and eagles and that kind of thing. But robins are certainly a popular species that people NestWatch. Yeah. And part of that may be their tendency to nest on or around our homes.
Right. So you probably get a lot of robin data. And are there other species that that you guys would be particularly interested in hearing more or learning more about through citizen viewers? Beyond just robins, let's say? Are there other species that would be like target species, you could say, for NestWatch?
So we accept any kind of nest that you find into the database, so there's no restriction there. In terms of the kind of research questions that we're asking, we tend to have targeted, focused research questions that vary as we discover and learn more. So new this year, we're collaborating with the Cornell University Museum of Vertebrates to study snake skin use as a nest material in great crested flycatcher nests. That's a mouthful to get out. They are beautiful cavity nesting flycatchers, a beautiful brown and yellow bird. And, so we're partnering there to ask questions about why do they put snake skins in their nests.
Yeah, what a cool behavior.
Strange, right? Not a whole lot of birds do it. Does it help? Is it a warning? Is it what is that for? What's that about? So we're asking that question this year. In the past, we have targeted questions such as, does feeding bluebirds and chickadees improve the nesting outcomes? So we've asked people. Well, so this is very new. I'm presenting this later this year at a conference, but so from what I've seen so far, there hasn't been a tremendous difference in the fed and unfed nests. So, but that's all very preliminary. So that's kind of a new subject that I'm newly interested in. Is does providing supplemental food really assist with the survival of the young? We've looked at predator guards on nest boxes and whether or not that has an impact on the success of the cavity nesting bird community. So we have a lot of different kinds of questions that shift over time. But any given year, you can tune in and participate in one of those specific kinds of questions or just contribute
To the general monitoring.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. And our robins seem to be doing really successfully. They're 8 days in. The chicks seem to be thriving by all accounts. And is that a pretty common thing that robins? Is there anything you can say commonly happens, let's say, with a whole species or with robins in the Northeast or something like that? And do our robins sort of, if you're following a robin nest in your yard, let's say, and it's being successful, does that tell you anything about how the birds are doing around you?
Yeah, that's a complex question. There are a lot of layers there.
Yeah,
I'll try to stay on task.
Unpack the ones
data.
that,
We need data, first of all.
Yeah.
More data is always great. But I was looking at the data from last year, and we did look at regional variation in nesting success of robins, which tend to be in our top 10 list that we look at from year to year. So the nesting success has been pretty typical of what you would expect. So anywhere from 50 to 70% successful.
Wow, that's great.
Around, depending on where you are in the country, and that's pretty good actually. If you consider that some species have much lower nesting success. We do tend to see higher nesting success in cavity nesting birds because obviously you can put them in a box and guard the box and protect them, so we tend to see a little bit higher nest success there. But last year in any case it looked like they were doing pretty well. So but it's always interesting to look into the data and see what the stories are. Yeah,
for sure. And that's where, since they're so easy, they're much easier to find than some nests. It's easy to wonder whether or not what you're seeing at a given nest is happening with the other birds that are nesting around it, I guess, in the area.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about my own nest boxes and my nests here in the Ithaca area.
That'd be great.
To get, to relate it back to this particular robin that seems to be doing just fine. It really depends on the species. I had Carolina wrens nesting in my front porch, and they already fledged their young, and everything was great. They seemed to do really well, and there were no hiccups there. It's been a different story out on the nest box trail. I don't know if it's been all the rain or the cool weather, but we've definitely seen, by we, I mean a team of local researchers who are monitoring nests around Ithaca. We've been seeing some struggles there, and it could be related to just the low availability of insects with all the crazy weather we've been having lately. This cool, rainy spring has not really helped.
Yeah, we've not seen much sun this spring. It's been a tough, though more or less typical Ithaca spring/winter still. And just so people, if you do hear, if our viewers hear some extraneous noise coming through the mic from time to time, we are sort of in a public part of the visitor center where you can go anytime up here on the second floor, but that also means people might come in at any point in time. And we did just get a big group of school children coming into the visitor center that are just like come in beneath me here. So enjoy the din if it rises. Yeah. They weren't on the schedule, but they're great. So one question that we get is, I have a robin that comes back to nest on my house every year for like 20 years. Is it the same pair? And is there a way for you to be able to tell that, or what can you tell a person who gives you a story like that or a question like that?
Yeah, so we really don't know. We don't have a great answer for that. I would say unless the birds have a band, like your robin has a band, it's hard to know if it's the same pair that comes back year after year. I suspect that it could be either one or the other of the pair that is, kind of imprinted on that location that might keep coming back, because they are territorial. They do defend a territory, and if it's been successful in the past, why wouldn't they use it again?
Sure.
That being said, the average lifespan of a robin is not 20 years. So what we could be seeing in those instances are either offspring that are, familiar with the area that didn't migrate, or just new robins that acknowledge and recognize that this is a great nesting spot. So it's hard to know for sure, but it's doubtful that it's the same exact pair of birds for 20 years. But.
Well, and Emma reached out to us on Twitter and sort of made the observation that the female on our camera seems to have a pretty dark plumage, both a dark head, she has that white spot on the back, and a fairly, rufusy chest. And she sort of remarked that she thought that female robins were usually lighter. And so I wondered if, if you, in your experience working with robins, you know, if you had a sense of, is there sort of a consistent way to differentiate between those males and females, and sort of, is there a wide variety or variation, I should say, in their plumage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they do tend to be sexually dimorphic, meaning the males and females look different from each other. It's typical for males to be darker around the hood, the face, and the back of the neck. That being said, individuals vary, and some females may have different hormone levels, or their plumage may just be really fresh and really bright because they've had a really great year and they're doing, growing fresh new plumage. So it really does vary, and it also depends on where you are in the country.
Oh,
so
really?
It's harder to predict that in some parts of the country. Out west, the robins are paler, so there still does tend to be that trend of males being darker and more colorful. But if you just showed me a picture of a robin from California and asked me if it was a male or a female, with my Eastern bias, I would probably say, oh, it's a female, without really thinking about it. But there are some geographic differences there.
Gotcha.
You can predict with pretty good confidence whether it's a male or female if you know the birds in your area and what they're supposed to look like, or what they traditionally do look like. But you always want to use caution, because you can never say 100%, as we know from some birds just being really bright.
Totally.
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah, and when I first saw the female, when we were setting up the camera, even when I saw a bird flush from around the nest, or we waited for the bird to fly, and I saw the bird land, and I was like, my goodness, that looks like a male robin. So even me, and I've seen a lot of robins in my life. At first, I thought that female was a male by plumage, because she was just so much contrast in her plumage. So in terms of, so we have males and females. Let's say we can't tell them apart that well from their plumage. Let's just say that for this pair, how might we also tell which one is female or male? Is there any other behavioral cues we might be able to use to help us? I mean, obviously the female has a band in our case, but what are there things the female does that the male doesn't?
So the females do most of the nest building, so their behavioral cues.
Yep.
The female is going to build the nest. The male might help choose the nest site or show some different nest sites, but the female is largely responsible for building it.
Okay.
Obviously, she lays the eggs.
Yeah, that's a real
does
one.
the lion's share of the work there with the nesting cycle, and the male will be bringing food to the nestlings once at that point. After they hatch. Behaviorally, like off nest, males sing and defend the territory. So you might see a singing male. It might be chasing an intruder off of its territory, getting into battles. Although you tend to see females being very territorial as well against other females.
Oh, interesting.
So,
okay.
There are some behavioral cues and some songs to listen for.
Nice.
To keep an eye out for.
And as far as the nest sites go, Ian gave us a question on Facebook. Is there, from your data maybe on NestWatch, is there any sort of pattern in the nest orientation of robins or any other species? If not, if you don't have data for robins, if there's other birds that you know of that have specific nest orientation preferences for their nests?
Yeah, so orientation for an open cup nest, that's a little interpretive question. Do you mean orientation of the bird on the nest, or the orientation of the way that the nest is facing? I haven't seen in the data or in the literature a lot of differences in orientation. What we do see are differences in nest placement, so nest height, and the substrate that the nest is on.
Okay.
So typically what we see in Ithaca in the early part of the spring is robins nesting low in an evergreen shrub. Obviously our robins did not take that. They didn't read that paper that told them where they were supposed to nest. But we do tend to see a progression from low evergreen shrubs to high in a deciduous tree. And the reason for that is they like to have dense cover overhead. Obviously, our guys found
very dense concrete,
some cover overhead, and they didn't need to worry about our vegetation leafing out.
Right.
So, but you see different things out west too. You see ground nests on the prairies and plains where there may not be as many trees. Even cliff nests in some situations. If there's a lot of canyons or cliffs around, they can choose that as well. So there's a lot of difference there. They're really adaptable.
Well, and do they? Will this be likely to, let's say they're successful on this nest, do they ever have more clutches of eggs in a summer or breeding season?
Yeah, I suspect you know the answer to that
I do.
because
I know
we have a
some
little
answers.
insider knowledge here that
do.
we actually have had robins reusing some of the nests around the building in
Over
the
and over
past.
again. Yes.
Year after year, in fact, because the mud in them actually is pretty well preserved with our roof overhang. But yeah, so robins will typically have 2, maybe even 3 nests in a year. They're very productive, so they can re-nest. They can go on to have a 3rd nest if there's in a pretty temperate area with good weather. And as I mentioned, we have even seen some fall
Yeah, it's incredible.
strange nesting behaviors. So they do re-nest. They'll have plenty of opportunities to try again. And for sure, if they don't come back to this one next year, then presumably they'll be somewhere in the
Right.
area on this territory.
And as we know, we were able to actually read the band on that bird with the camera. And somebody here in the building that has been banding birds here locally for some time banded this female back in 2014, and she was at least already in the 2nd year of her life. So she was in full adult plumage at that point. So she's at least 4 years old, possibly older, which is a nice prime of her life kind of age for a robin, as far as we can tell. Barbara on Facebook was wondering, we've seen the robin, usually the female, kind of poking her bill into the nest. This was even, I think, while the eggs were there and while the chicks were very young. So it was clear that she wasn't sort of tending necessarily to the eggs or the chicks. And wondered if you had any insight on what she might be doing, manipulating, sort of looking like she was manipulating the nesting substrate, but it was hard to tell whether she was going after something in the nest substrate or, so I wondered if you had any insight into what she might be doing there.
Yeah, it could have been a number of different things. So they do turn the eggs, but it sounds like that was not what was being seen at that point. So apart from egg turning, we do see adults tend to clean the nest, so they keep the nest clean. They might have been removing any eggshell fragments or possibly any invertebrates that were occupying the nest, trying to get rid of any mites or the stray flea or tick that was in the nest. So that could be happening. We also know that birds repair the nest from time to time, so if something just wasn't quite sitting right, she may have been adjusting it. It's really hard to know. Even just, kind of preening the chicks occasionally, I have seen birds try to preen the feather sheaths off of the young.
Oh, wow.
So
that's pretty cool.
Who knows? But those are some of the options of what might be going on down there.
And the first hatching nestling is about 8 days old today. What's the range of time when robins number of days it usually takes them to fledge?
Yeah, so 12 to 14 days is the typical range. What I have been seeing out in the nest boxes of some similar, in a similar climate and region as this, is it's been taking a little bit longer. And maybe these guys hatched past the point where we were having some poor weather. So I think that they should be on track, but I have been seeing a little bit of a delay in the other birds around the area.
Well, so for viewers, that would be, probably sometime Friday through Monday, possibly later, depending on whether or not they're sort of been delayed a little bit by the cold weather. But that's pretty exciting, but it's incredible they can grow that fast.
Yeah, 13 days is just nothing. It's instant.
To go from an egg to something that can sort of fly out of the nest in that short a period of time, I have a hard time getting the dishes washed. I feel like sometimes in that amount of time. Right?
Or the laundry.
Exactly, the laundry. That's the worst. So Tweety Bird, that's a good name for Twitter. Tweety Bird on Twitter. She made an observation that we've actually gotten a lot of feedback about. She says, "I noticed the robin take the baby's poop as it came out. Does this happen in just robins or other birds too, and why?"
That's a really interesting bit of housekeeping, actually. So lots of small songbirds do have this fecal sac nest sanitation. And what it is just a kind of a gelatinous membrane around the excreta, you might say, that makes it easier to carry the waste away. And you might carry your waste away from the nest for a number of hygienic reasons, just to keep the bacteria levels low in the nest. It's also possible that it could function as a predator deterrent. So if there's not an accumulation,
like smell or
exactly, cues that would cue in predators to find the nest. So it could have a number of different functions. But the thing that I think is most interesting about it is how instantaneous it is. And if you think about it, that makes sense because the bird comes in with food and it comes away with a fecal sac to either to swallow or to drop. As the chicks get older, they'll drop them And that's a really efficient way of doing things, because otherwise they'd have to make a separate trip.
Twice the number of visits.
Exactly. One for deliveries and one for removals. So in this way, they managed to make both legs of the journey efficient and useful. And it's just kind of instantaneous. And I think that's really strange.
Well, it's impressive to watch them get fed, and then just, the chicks will settle back down in the nest, and then they'll just sort of start turning their rear ends up, and the adults are just sitting there waiting for it. Half the number of visits to the nest. I mean, for me, the easiest way to find a nest is to watch an adult bird, flying around a little bit during this time of year. And especially if they're carrying food, they're going to lead you to a nest, right? Mm-hmm. And so by cutting down those nest visits in half, that might be a really important part of the, reducing the visits so that predators and other things can't cue in on it as well.
Well, we do know that not all birds do this. So I wanted to just mention quickly that some species don't have this mechanism, and we don't see it in pigeons and doves, house finches, goldfinches. A lot of your more vegetarian birds tend to just excrete right outside the nest. Huh. There's no carrying it away. So
interesting.
Depending on which species might be nesting on your home or on your front porch or balcony, that might be a good thing or a bad thing, but you might be fertilizing your potted plant that your house finch might be nesting in.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So they may or may not be as welcome in some parts of our front doors and our front patios, but it's easy to clean up. So
yeah,
I let them do it.
Well, we've certainly seen different big birds taking a different approach to it, like the Cornell hawks on campus, or even the herons back here at the pond. For quite a while, they get over to the edge of the nest and let it fly. And, at least the hawks on campus, I think the people parking underneath the lights over there learn that pretty fast.
It's like a vacancy of parking spaces.
Or there's just some cars with some fair bit of white on them. So one question, one person is worried about a robin's nested someplace where they need to come in and out quite a bit, and she's wondered, if she's disturbing it, how long can the eggs remain uncovered, and before the robin's breeding is affected, right? So if she's going in and out, let's say to a shed to get her riding lawnmower in and out, is there some period of time after which it's not that's bad? Because they do fly off the nest to forage and things like that. Is there any sort of guideline? Not that you can make the robin go back, but when would you call a nest abandoned? I guess is sort of the end game of that question.
Yeah, that's a difficult thing to assess, because some birds are much more tolerant of disturbance than others. And, our nests here are getting a little bit of foot traffic underneath, and they seem to be okay with that. But in the case where a bird might be nesting, we see this a lot with robins on front doors. They love front door wreaths and patio lights, and we see that a lot. And so this is a common question, and it's just really hard to predict. I would say you could know that a nest was abandoned if, that 12 to 14 day incubation period has come and gone and nobody's attending the nest. And sometimes that, they could be off the nest for more hours or more percentage of their time than they normally would, and the nest will still be fine as long as it's being incubated.
Gotcha. So they can, the eggs can withstand some variation in their incubation
definitely
rhythm.
Yeah, they can. They're adapted to withstand some temperature variations and being left alone. That being said, I don't know of a great way to prevent that from happening. And I've dealt with this with robins nesting right over my front door, and I found that not making eye contact was helpful. If I avoided eye contact, she would stay on her nest and we would leave each other alone. I could still get in my house, but it really depends on the individual bird, and just maybe try not to make eye contact and keep the disturbance to a minimum. But sometimes they just nest right on our front door, and there's nothing to be done about it, and you assume that they knew that when they
chose to nest
there.
Right. So we have a kindergarten class, Mrs. Wyman's class, and they've been wondering how the mom sits on the hatchlings without hurting them, and it kind of gets to the idea of what mom's even doing in that situation. So I don't know if you might be able to speak to why mom even does sit on these nestlings, and maybe why it doesn't hurt them.
Yeah, that's a fun question. So I guess we're talking about brooding the young, and the mom coming to the nest and kind of warming them, and they'll do this at night and sleep on the nest, and throughout cool periods for the first few days, especially when the young can't can't thermoregulate or keep themselves warm. So the parent will do this. And yeah, I suspect that even if she was putting all her weight on them, that they would still be fine because it's all proportional to the life scale of a robin.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So,
Small little guy, right?
yeah, maybe you're getting sat on by your mom, but your mom weighs less than an iPhone. So,
Right.
you know, birds are, they're light. So the adults are fairly light to begin with.
Yeah.
Like I said, lighter than an iPhone. So we're not talking about a heavy bird. And then babies are resilient. They have bones. They're accustomed to this lifestyle, and they're mashing and climbing on top of each other as well. So
yeah, I also kind of think of it when I look at that robin. It seems like such a big bird, but I know that all that rounded bigness of that robin, a bunch of it's just essentially a big fluffy pillow. And so when I see her sitting on the young, my imagination is more like there's a pillow with a skeleton inside it, kind of. And as it sits down on them, the pillow just kind of envelops them a little bit, at least in some sense. There's obviously skin and organs and other things in there, but all those are squishy. So, but it's a good question, when you see them all cramming into that nest. And probably as they get bigger, she'll spend less and less time doing that, right?
yeah. Kindergartners are great at asking questions that are difficult to answer.
Definitely. That's what makes them so great.
That is, exactly.
So, we've seen them bring lots of different stuff to the nest, but one thing obviously that people think of when they think of robins is worms, And so Leslie wrote us an email asking us, what else do they eat besides worms? And does dry weather make it hard for them to find worms? And those seem like good questions.
Yeah, those are good questions. Of course, certainly they eat earthworms and other small, soft insects. These soft-bodied insects are things like grubs or caterpillars, typically unarmored caterpillars that don't have the spiky hairs and the needles. So inchworms are a type of caterpillar that are really particularly delectable. They're very soft and squishy and essentially defenseless. So
you're speaking like you've tried them.
Yeah, exactly. No, I've seen birds just cleaning up the geometric caterpillars, the little tiny inchworm guys, and they just clean up. They love them, and they're just defenseless, so they're great bird fodder.
Yeah.
Of course, as the chicks get a little bit older, they can be fed more whole insects that maybe aren't as soft and squishy. And of course, fruit. Fruit is a big part of the robin's diet. So they're going to be getting more fruit as the fruits become available. Maybe there's already some fruits that are available that have been out there. So it's a good mixture. They're pretty omnivorous and opportunistic.
That's maybe one of the things that helps buffer their response to that warming trend as well, right? That you were talking about earlier, just the fact they can eat so many different things.
I didn't address the drought earthworm question, and I'm probably not the best person to talk about earthworm survival of droughts, but if you notice, robins do typically do a lot of their foraging early in the morning and in the evening when the earthworms are closest to the surface. And earthworms tend to be in places where there is a lot of organic matter in the soil, and the precipitation and the soil humidity is conducive to being an earthworm. So they tend to, they have their habitat preferences, and they have their behavioral patterns that robins are cueing in on. So the robins are good at figuring out when to get the worms, but yeah, I would imagine if there was a severe drought, the earthworms would kind of
be more difficult,
hunker down and be difficult for the robins to get to. But in those cases, they would hopefully find some fruits or other food sources.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes left before noon here, and got a few questions left that have been asked from the community, and a couple of them involve conserving or helping birds like robins. And Melanie asked on email, does putting lots of chemicals on the lawn hurt the survival of robins and their chicks? And this is a great question because lots of people love their lawns and want to care for their lawns. There's places like golf courses, obviously, and robins probably like those big expanses, as well as other birds like bluebirds and things. So is there anything that science actually can tell us about that you guys, either via NestWatch or something you've read while sort of looking at these habitat associations, that helps us know whether or not treating our lawns is bad for robins?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and
Good starting point,
the
right?
literature and the science certainly suggests that pesticides on lawns are very problematic. So robins being getting most of their food from the ground, they're very vulnerable to pesticide poisoning. So you want to be not spraying anything like that. And another question that comes up occasionally is fertilizers. And what if you're just putting a fertilizer on? And to be honest, I'm not quite sure what the impact of fertilizer only is on robins. I mean, I don't really know how that interacts with the earthworms that they eat and the other invertebrates that they're foraging on. So I'm not completely sure, and I don't know. I haven't. Maybe there are some studies. I'm not familiar with them about fertilizers, but definitely pesticides should be avoided.
And it would seem like pesticides would remove a lot of the reasons why robins would want to be there as well, right?
Definitely.
The pesticides are removing the food. That's also probably not great for robins. The food they're going to find is potentially pesticide impregnated, but there may just not be enough food for them for it to be good habitat.
Yeah.
Let's see here. The second one is actually kind of related to one I asked before about abandoning it. Ginny wrote via email about being in a garden center and potentially having a robin abandon her nest. So I feel like we've dealt with that one with the earlier statement. So one question, and it doesn't really involve nesting so much. So you can say whether or not you feel like you're kind of in a great spot to answer it. But a lot of people think of robins as being the hallmark of spring, right? Oh, the robins are back, right? And you have had some birds nesting in odd times of the year, which suggests that sometimes maybe they don't go anywhere. And so I didn't know if you knew anything about what they're doing when they're not sitting there beautifully nesting on your house. They can tell people a little bit more about what they're doing sort of across the year of their life, right? Between breeding cycles, I guess.
Yeah, so obviously I do study nesting birds, and I'm not a person who puts geolocators on robins and knows where they're going. But what we know from things like eBird and Christmas bird counts and surveys that citizen scientists have contributed to, as well as professionals who are putting bands on robins and looking at the band return rates, is that robins really are they're short distance migrants. They're following their seasonal availability of food. So they're looking for fruit. They're moving around, responding to earthworm availability and other arthropod availability and fruit. So the average distance that they move in a season is not that far. We do see movements down from Canada into the southern and coastal states where it's a bit more temperate and overwintering there. And you might see some local resident robins mixing with the Canadian robins, which is understandable, and I would want to move south as well.
Yeah, right.
But they're not obligated to migrate. So I think what we're seeing when we see these big flocks of robins in the spring, it certainly could be some of the ones that chose to winter a little bit south are moving back up, or it could just be your local flock that is, they've exhausted the food in one area, so now they've moved into your neighborhood to find the food there. So we do see some seasonal movements, but the arguments are kind of weak that they make these really distinct big movements. Yeah.
That's always, I always wind up, we'll get these flocks of robins that come through in the late winter, hitting our sumac, for example, or finding, some late berries that hadn't been eaten by somebody else. And it's always amazing to see them in big groups. One of my favorite things to do when there's a late snowstorm after they've come back is actually go shovel a chunk of my yard. And then all of a sudden there's this immense concentration of robins all hopping around in the backyard in a single patch of grass, right? Because they won't forage on the snow that much. So yeah, they're just incredibly adaptable birds. So that's through most of our questions that we've had. I wondered if you might be able to give folks an idea of what the next 5 or 6 days might hold for this nest that they're going to see on camera. Like what's sort of how's this going to progress? Right now we have 3 nestlings who opened their eyes maybe a couple days ago and are eating pretty well. How are they going to continue to change before they fly off at the end of it?
Yeah, good question. I can answer that based on what I know happens in most nests. The nestlings will continue to gain weight, and they'll actually achieve probably approaching their maximum mass in the next couple of days, and then they'll lose a little bit of weight typically right before fledging. As they get a little bit leaner and start exercising those wing muscles. But yeah, their feathers will come in a little bit more than they are right now. They actually have really cute little like short stubby tails and short wing feathers, so they'll get a little cuter. If you're not into it right now, they're definitely going to get cuter over time. They'll start standing up in the nest and getting a little bit more restless, maybe peeking out and becoming more aware of what's going on around them. So what we see with most nestlings is they're kind of unaware of, they'll beg at anything that approaches during the early days, and then as they get more aware, they get a little bit more alert and perhaps fearful of any kind of activity right around the nest. So once you start to see that, you know that fledging is going to follow pretty soon. Like I said, they might drop a little bit of weight, start moving around and getting a little friskier and exercising and moving around in the nest more. But yeah, if things go well, then I think that we should be looking at a fledge pretty soon, and that could take, maybe they would all fledge in the same day, maybe not. Perhaps there might be a 24 hours difference between the first and the last ones to go, but the parents will continue to feed them until they all fledge. So I think we're on track here for a good nesting cycle.
It's exciting. Well, yeah, we can never tell what happens, especially what's going to happen, I should say. But it's been really fun watching them so far, and it's been really great talking with you today about Robyns and about NestWatch. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to remind everybody, if you want to learn more about NestWatch, you can check out NestWatch at nestwatch.org. You can learn about what it takes to become a NestWatcher yourself, and you can start looking outside wherever you're going, seeing if you too can notice nests of birds like this robin or other birds that might live around you. And just a reminder, they have tools on that website to help you learn what birds might be around you, to help you with building nest boxes, and to give you all the tools necessary to feel like a competent, safe nest monitor. So thanks again to Robyn Bailey, project leader for NestWatch. And thanks everybody who watched out there in Camland. This is Charles Odermeyer coming to you live from Sapsucker Woods, and thanks a lot for listening today. Bye-bye.